history books out. I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time, so I am incredibly famous. You should definitely pay attention to whatever I say. Despite the fact that in the last two tours I've kind of thrown my voice out, so I've been joking we're going to have to do the beatnik tour this time. We're going to have to talk about how we'll let us compare architecture while the L train runs by like the ghost of Gene Krupa under a buttery cue ball moon that shines down over the ashes of fireplace Chicago. I can only do that for so long before I start to look like a weirdo. That doesn't usually stop me. Alright, so once again, welcome aboard. We're going to go ahead and get started with a little bit of very basic architecture 101. You can't really see a whole lot of Beaux-Arts style 19th century architecture from here anymore. Used to be a couple examples, but now they're building some new construction over here at Riverfront, so we'll have to kind of backtrack towards it. Now, in the 1920s came the first really great wave of 20th century architecture, which was called Art Deco. You'll see Art Deco all over the city. The architecture of the Jazz Age featured a streamlined verticality and simple geometric art. An example of a sort of a shorter Art Deco building is over here on our left, this one with all of the long vertical windows. That is our old post office by Graham Anderson Probst in white 1930. Better example, as we move a little bit further, if you look up ahead behind the crane, you can see the Chicago Board of Trade building from 1930 by Hollenberg and Rope with its simple geometric art. Now that's one of my absolute favorites, especially at night. One thing they thought of doing with Art Deco buildings in the 30s is having big dramatic lighting schemes to light them up. When they light this one up at night, it looks very much like something out of Gotham City. In fact, it was the Bruce Wayne building in Batman Begins. Up on top of that is a statue of Ceres, the Roman goddess of grains and agriculture. After Art Deco came modernism, the style of the mid-20th century. In front of us you can see several examples of very plain black rectangles. That's modernism. The aesthetic back then was less is more, less is more. But after a while people started saying less is a bore. Why don't we take these plain black rectangles and bend them around a little bit, try a different color, bring back some of the cool old styles now that we have more technology to do it with. So then we had postmodernism. Really, anytime you find a building and can't quite describe how to describe it, just call it postmodern. Just say, oh, how postmodern. You'll probably be right. Postmodern is a very broad term. Like right in front of us, there's one with all of the balconies in front of it. That is a postmodernism by Ralph Johnson called 225 Van Buren, sometimes known as the Morse code building. It's the dots and dashes of the balconies kind of do look like Morse code. And in fact, you can translate it into Morse code. It says PRT, DST over and over again, which means nothing. It's just what it happens to translate to when you punch it into a translator engine. So to backtrack just a little bit, over on the right, to the right of that one, you can see this cream-colored building with a row of columns up on top there. Kind of a neoclassical style. That is a Daniel Burnham building from 1907. Daniel Burnham is one of our greatest and most important architects in Chicago. That particular one is called the Insurance Exchange Building. It's a style known as either neoclassical or Beaux-Arts, French for fine arts, a style popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that, my friends, is Architecture 101. My favorite out of all of those is the Board of Trade, which now you can see without the crane blocking our view. Statue on top is Ceres, the Roman goddess of grains and agriculture. The pyramid structure underneath Ceres there is an old observation deck. For about 25 years, that was the tallest building in the city. The observation deck space is still there. They just won't let anybody in to see it anymore. Believe me, I've tried. Usually I can talk my way into any of these places. That one I'm still working on. Now in front of that, you can see this glass building with what appears to be a lollipop on top. That is a postmodern addition to the Art Deco building by the architect Helmut Jahn. One thing postmodernists really like to do was do 1980s modern-style versions of old designs. Like right in front of us here, you can see this one rising up to the sky with a circular thing on top of it. That is called 311 South Wacker by Cone Peterson and Fox. Postmodernism from the late 80s stretching into the early 90s. There's a lot of urban legends saying that it was supposed to look like somebody's engagement ring or something. The real truth is they were trying to design a postmodern version of the Chicago Tribune building. If you're from Chicago, you probably know the Chicago Tribune building. If you're not, don't worry, we're going to show it to you later on. Now, we have lost a lot of height records in Chicago over the years. It's the kind of thing you can't really get that upset about because that's just how the world spins. If you build a tall building, you know that somebody else is going to build a taller one. It's all part of answering the great and ultimately human question of how high of a building can we really build. But when 311 South Wacker was built at 990 feet, it was the tallest building in the world that didn't have a name, just its address. And it held on to that record until just a few years ago when New York had to go and build a taller building without a name, and that one really gets my goat. I want that one back. In fact, now New York has several buildings that are taller than that don't have a name. They're much harder to remember the names of when they only go by the address, too, so for a tour guide, that's a real pain in the neck. course, rising behind it, the granddaddy of them all, hovering over all the other buildings, rising above them all as sure as Kilimanjaro rises like Olympus above the Serengeti. The Sears Tower stands 1,451 feet tall. The official name is now the Willis Tower, but locals still refer to it as the Sears under penalty of torture. On a clear day from the observation deck, you can see 4 states. Today's selections are Wisconsin, Indiana, Nebraska, and New Jersey. Always fun to see if anybody believes me about the New Jersey part. Jeff, it's way more than you think. It's actually Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and who can think of the 4th one? That's Illinois. Kind of a trick question.
Sorry.
But really what you see with the Sears is 9 very plain black rectangle buildings all bundled together. Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, the firm behind it, was really into plain black rectangles in the 70s. One single plain black rectangle there wouldn't have held up to the wind, but the engineer Fosler Kahn, the Einstein of structural engineering, and his partner Bruce Campbell, the architect, came up with what was called bundled tube construction. Now this was a big thing. After that first burst of skyscrapers in the 30s, they hadn't built a 1,000-foot skyscraper again in about 40 years, until Fosler Kahn came along, came up with a way to do it more cheaply. By bundling all of these things together, they strengthen one another. Like America, these 9 tubes are stronger together. So it ended up being 1,451 feet tall. For 25 years, that was the tallest building in the world. A very long time for any building to hold on to that record, really. Now, it is still the highest occupied floor in the United States. There's one taller building in New York, but only if you count the spire. However, they're now building Central Park Tower in New York. That'll lay a higher occupied floor. And of course, it's not the tallest building in the world anymore. That honor currently goes to the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And that one is already about to lose its record, the Jeddah Tower in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The Burj Khalifa is 2,700 feet tall, which is like 2 of the Sears Tower. Go all the way up to the top of that and then double it. This one is 1,451 feet. Plus another few hundred if you count the spire, though it's a weird thing in architecture rules. The spires don't count. The spires do count, antennas don't. But the Jeddah Tower at 3,000 feet, and the Burj Khalifa at 2,700, and the new Central Park Tower at 1,500 were all designed by Chicago architect Adrian Smith, so we still win. His office is just a couple of blocks over that way, and Adams Street here was named after me. There should really be an apostrophe on the sign. I keep telling the alderman. He keeps telling me, Adam, stop being such a grammar snob. I say, technically, that makes me a punctuation snob. He says, well, there you go. That's the thing we have, me and the alderman. For those not from around here, aldermen are like the mayors of neighborhoods. Now we'll move into some modernism. Over on the left here, we've got Gateway 2 and Gateway 1, early 60s buildings by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. These are what architects would refer to as Miesian, because they look like something that might have been designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, an architect who was kind of like the father of modernism, a German architect that we eventually imported here into Chicago. So, in a good Miesian building, you can never see the seams, never see the screws. They're endlessly elegant and simple. Though, these weren't by him, but Skidmore, Owings & Merrill were so enamored of Mies's philosophy and Mies's style in those days that Frank Lloyd Wright used to call Skidmore, Owings & Merrill the 3 blind mice. But to his credit, Van der Rohe came out of the period of Germany between the world wars, when the idea was there weren't a lot of resources, so you had to make as big a building as you could with as little materials as you could. And they still look endlessly modern today. They haven't dated quite as badly as a lot of buildings from the era have. And now we'll move into some post-modernism with Fujikawa and Johnson's 1980s building, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Center. Sometimes I forget the name of that one, but luckily it's carved right on it. It's like a cue card. Now, the central portion here was originally a stock trading pit. It is being held up structurally by the 2 towers on the side. The 2 towers on the sides were built very specifically with executives in mind. Because, executives all want a corner office. Usually you only get 4 corner offices to go around. Here, between the 2 towers, they have 32 corner offices per floor. That way, nobody has to feel left out, and everybody gets to be a winner. Which sounds like a great setup for a joke about millennials. But it was for baby boomers. And I'm a couple of years older than the millennials myself, but I did try avocado toast the other day, and I liked it. You know what? No lies, I loved that avocado toast. For $14, I better have loved that avocado toast. On our right over here, we've got the Chicago Civic Opera Building, Art Deco by Graham Anderson Probst in white, 1929. Of course, in the 1920s, they thought having a Roman-style letter U was the classiest thing ever, so it's the Civic Opera Building. You can also see, like, the the Public Library and the art books of them. So this was built for a guy named Samuel Edsel, a utilities kingpin and also a big opera financier. There's a lot of urban legends about it being shaped like a throne, and the real reason is just these two towers on the side were supposed to be offices whose rent money would help keep the opera afloat, which was necessary because even when you sold every ticket to an opera, they usually didn't make any money. So this was a very good idea, but it kind of fell apart in execution because the place opened in November of 1929, about 3 weeks after the stock market crash that kicked off the Great Depression. Edsel himself lived up in the penthouse, but he lost all of his money and all the money of 30,000 investors in his holding company and had to flee to Greece. Like you do. Now, Graham Anderson Probst & White recently had another building right over here, but it was only about 5 stories tall. It was not using what we were calling the best and tallest possible use of the space. And when a building is not using the best and tallest possible use of the space, that means it's not long for this earth around here. So now it's been torn down. Ketch Partners is building a new building here. We're just starting to see the shape of it. It's going to have some cool structural bracings that mask off a whole cool new Riverwalk portion. It's like a 45-foot long Riverwalk. That's going to be kind of cool. But as we go by, if you take a look at this building behind it, the brown one, 123 Wacker, that was designed to be sort of a postmodern take on the look of the old Civic Opera building. Ralph Johnson Architects, same guy who did the build of the balconies, made a lot of waves in 1986 because he had designed it using one of those newfangled computer machines, which in 1986 was still newsworthy. Oh, and probably the question I get asked the most, how many Starbucks do you have around here anyway? This was one of our first, currently the last time anybody counted, we were up to 289. Hey everybody! And that's just within the city limits. If you got the suburbs, nobody even knows how many Starbucks we have around here. Partly because nobody really agrees on what counts as a suburb and what doesn't. Like, I meet people all the time who tell me they live in the suburbs and they live in, like, Columbus, Ohio. On the right, another one not using the best and tallest possible use of the space, but we love this one, the Great Lakes Building by Hullabert and Roche, 1912. Now this one, being that small, is probably not long for this earth, but we hope this one hangs on. We love this one. 100 years ago, this whole river would have looked like this. It would have looked kind of grim and oppressive after a while, but just one of them adds a nice splash of color. Now here's a low bridge. River level is actually pretty low today. I'm not as fearing for my life as I sometimes do on this ship. But I love being a tour guide. I literally risk my neck for this job regularly. Eventually, I'm probably going to be one of the attractions on one of the ghost tours in town. The tour is going to start with Zorro. The old tour guide here was an idiot. On the right, this is a postmodern version of a hammock. And back behind the postmodern hammock, the graceful curving building is 333 Wacker by Cohn Peterson and Fox, one of the most popular buildings in the city, 1980s postmodernism. Like a lot of postmodernism, there's a lot of what's called contextualism. It's the way that architects kind of blend in with the environment very subtly. Curves right along with the curve of the river. Of the two colors of glass, at least one usually matches the color of the water. Circular grates at the bottom match the circular grates of the next building over, another Cohn Peterson and Fox joint. And then of the octagon-shaped support columns match the octagons over at the merchandise mart across the river, which I'll talk about later on. Now, this building, of course, is probably best known now for being the building where Ferris Bueller's dad works in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And somehow thought he was going to get home to Highland Park at 5:30. Now, really, if you leave at 2 o'clock, you can get to Highland Park at 5:30. I want to do a whole other movie called Ferris Bueller's Dad's Commute. It'll explain how he did it using some secret tunnels, possibly a wormhole, possibly help from the Russian mafia. I haven't decided for sure yet. Magical assistance, a dark night of the soul, etc. Hey! Some people are enjoying the Riverwalk, as you can see. Also, we've got the new projectors here that project movies onto the merchandise mart at night. So the newest thing called Art on the Mart. Part of the new redevelopment of the Riverwalk that's been going on the last several years. Up on top there, you can see people walking along on Upper Wacker Drive. Down behind the wall is hidden Lower Wacker Drive, which is kind of like the express lanes. Below that, there's also Lower Wacker Drive, which is mostly used for drag racing. Now, having a bi-level road like this that goes around the business district was a part of Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago in 1909, a very innovative plan. For years, people remembered Burnham more as a city planner than they did as an architect. That started to change fairly recently because he was the main designer behind the World's Fair of 1893. It's become very popular to study the World's Fair of 1893 lately. Here's a low bridge. So, for the World's Fair of 1893, it's impossible to overstate what a big deal that was, both for the city and for architecture. He designed a whole lot of buildings with a lot of Greek revivalism. You can still see echoes of that in buildings from a generation later. Like over here on the right, this is the Builders Building by Graham, Anderson, Probst, and Whites from 1920. Almost 30 years after the fair, was still using the neoclassical elements. Like up on top, the row of columns, a colonnade of columns that's called, where the colonnaded ruins domino. So, if you walk around downtown, look up now and then, notice just how often you see a row of columns along the top of a building like that. If you're not looking, you never notice, but they're everywhere. Including at the Marshall Fields that is now the Macy's over at State and Randolph, which incidentally is one of the very few places downtown that I can actually reliably trace Al Capone to. It came out during his trial that he used to buy all of his underwear at that Marshall Fields. It was custom tailored Union suits that cost about $20 a pair in 1920s money. That's like $500 for underpants in today's money. Now, I can't quite trace him to this building on the right, the LaSalle Wacker building with the flag, but I can't trace his gang there. In 1933, the remnants of his gang were operating out of a building on the 8th floor. Capone was in jail by then, so they were operating under the leadership of Frank the Enforcer Nitti. Nitti was not quite as good at hiding from the cops as Capone was. Cops broke into the LaSalle Wacker building, shot Frank the Enforcer Nitti up pretty good one day. They didn't kill him, but it's not like he lived to a ripe old age or anything. Very few of the gangsters did. After all, it was not a job where you had a long life expectancy, but you did get to buy really nice underwear while you were here. So sometimes, you just have to make a decision about what's really important to you. Alright, so on the right, one of my favorites, 77 Wacker, the old United building, 1990 to Stefano and Partners, Ricardo Bofill, the architect. Let's see if I can pick up on the drums here. Ricardo Bofill, the architect of 77 Wacker building. Nope. Up along top is a postmodern take on the old rows of columns. 4 of them extend all the way down to tie the entire building together. Endlessly classical and endlessly modern at the same time. I don't think that one is ever going to quite go out of style. So rising up ahead of us now, the green one with the gold tower on top, one of my very favorites, the carbide and carbon building from 1930 by Burnham and Burnham, Daniel Burnham's sons. Now, according to legend, when they designed that one, they wanted it to look like a champagne bottle, Art Deco style. Now, nobody's ever really found an article or a letter they wrote where they actually said that themselves, so it might just be an urban legend, but it does kind of look like a champagne bottle. And, that would have been kind of charmingly subversive of them on their part in 1930, because in 1930, Prohibition was still going on. The Prohibition still going on, champagne was illegal, not that really stopped anybody from drinking it in Chicago. Or anywhere really, but in Chicago in particular, the number of places where you can go to drink is estimated to have tripled under Prohibition. Hard to tell for sure, because these illegal speakeasies were not known for keeping good paperwork. So naturally, we end up with a lot of urban legends about them. Like this building here with the dome on top, the Jewelers Building, one of the last of the great Beaux-Arts style buildings from 1924. People love to say that Capone had a speakeasy under